about King Solomon, and specifically today we'll be covering First Kings, the third chapter, and the fourth chapter. So if y'all turn to that, First Kings chapter 3 and 4. All right, so last Sunday we had singing on Wednesday night. So last Sunday, these are some of the things that we covered specifically. Remember, David passes away, so David's death. And before that, remember he had given Solomon several pieces of advice in dealing with several folks. Um, Solomon's reign then begins earnestly because David has passed away. Now he is the king, and he's now alone. And let's see, Solomon then has to deal with Adonijah, his brother, who came to his mother, if you remember, and asked for one of David's concubines. He deals with Joab because of the blood that was on his hands, and he also deals with Shimei. Took about 3 years before that situation happened, but that was the story that was told in First Kings, the second chapter. So now we continue on. The last verse of chapter 2, it says, "Thus the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon." And so now we begin to see some of the other things that Solomon does. And if you remember, Tim had gone over, all that Solomon did that was recorded for us is only in just a few chapters in First Kings. So we'll only have a few more classes on him just based upon what is recorded for us. But we'll begin in chapter 3 and verse 1. It says, "Then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem." So we begin here, and some things that we should remember about Solomon. What is one that we all remember, hopefully, about Solomon? Besides, he was wise. Has something to do with marriage. Lots of wives, right? Here he's taken the Pharaoh's daughter as an alliance in kind of a treaty with Egypt, right? And so do we read anywhere in here where this is recommended by God? Is this what he needed to do to make sure that he had a good relationship with Egypt? No, unfortunately not. But he does take her as a wife. That helps solidify his alliance with Egypt, and creates peace from that standpoint with Egypt on that side. In 1 Kings, the 9th chapter, in verse 16, we see that Pharaoh actually, as a gift, I guess, with his daughter, he goes off and he captures a geezer, burns it to the ground, and then gives it to Solomon. At this point, and we'll study about that a little later, but it's at that point he rebuilds that city, and I think turns it into one of his storehouses. But that's what Pharaoh does because of this alliance and this marriage. And then it tells us that he took her, brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house. If we look in the reading that was outlined, but we can flip over there real quick in 2 Chronicles, chapter 8, verse 11. It tells us specifically something at this point that is in Solomon's head, and that is that he did not want his foreign wife to dwell in the house of David, the king of Israel, because the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy. So I think at this point we see that Solomon does understand this concept of this foreign wife and what is happening in Jerusalem and where the ark is, and knows that he does not want her to come and be able to dwell in that area or in that house because the ark had been there. So he's separating that. We'll certainly see later in his life some things that happen that create issues with that. In 1 Kings, the 11th chapter, let's flip over there. We'll study this in a couple of weeks, but I think it's important right now for us to understand. In 1 Kings 11, and I want to read 1 through 4. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord has said to the sons of Israel, "You shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods." Solomon held fast to these loves. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord God, his God, as the heart of David his father had been. So we have one verse in the beginning of chapter 3 that tells us that he marries this daughter of Pharaoh, and then by the end of his life we see that this became a very common practice, and to the point that he had hundreds of wives. That's, I think, an important point, and we'll get back to this maybe at the end of class. Some lessons that we can pull from that. So now we begin further down in verse 2 through 5, and Solomon is now in Gibeon. It says that the people were still sacrificing on the high places because there wasn't a house built. What was Solomon's main charge, and what is he going to do the first 7-10 years of his being the king? Did somebody say it? I think they did. Right? He's building a temple. Now, what's in Gibeon now? Why would they go to Gibeon now? That's where the tabernacle is. Okay, it's also where the bronze altar still is. But where's the ark? Should remember that, because last quarter we had the whole movement of the ark on a cart. Remember that? So the ark has now been taken from Gibeon and brought over to Jerusalem. So some of the articles are not all in the tabernacle, but Gibeon is still where the tabernacle is. So Solomon goes there, and I think verse 3 tells us a little bit more about Solomon and what his thoughts are. But Gibeon's a high place where the sacrifices were offered, and then let's just read verse 3. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So there's one word in verse 3 that catches my attention every time, right? Except, right? Just said it. We always say but today. Right? I'll do that but here, Solomon did all of this except he did something else. Right? He didn't quite buy all the way in, and we certainly see that with his life. Something we need to keep in mind as we read about Solomon and all that he does. But in this particular case, we see something that I think many of us can learn from when we begin in verse 6. In verse 5, it says, "In Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night." So, so now Solomon is sleeping, and God says, "Ask what you wish me to give you." Then we see Solomon's response in verses 6 through 9, which is actually a beautiful response, and one that I think we should all contemplate what we would say in that particular case. But Solomon's response is one that is not tied to his own selfishness and his own acts and what he would want to accomplish, but what he wants um, to do for the Lord. So Solomon says, "You have grown, you have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours?" So, Solomon's request here, the wisdom and the ability to judge the Lord's people. What would we do if the Lord appears to us in a dream and asks the same question? Would we think about the things that we want done? Would we think about our own selfish thoughts? But um, instead, Solomon says, I want to be able to judge your people the way that they should be judged, and have this ability to discern what is right and what is wrong. Um, Back to the tabernacle a bit. In Deuteronomy, the 12th chapter, I kind of skipped over this, but I think it's an important part. It's a great reason for the building of the temple, but in Deuteronomy chapter 12, the first 14 verses of chapter 12, we see here that God has laid out some of the things that he expects of the people when they're at Mount Sinai, and they're building the tabernacle and all the pieces. And he talks about the fact in verse 3, "You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their names from that place." Verse 5, it indicates that you're gonna pick a place where you put um, my name, and then everyone there should come and gather. And then again in verse 13, he indicates the same thing, that all these things that they were to do when they entered into the kingdom, they were to um, say to the kingdom when they entered into Canaan, right? They were to choose the place where they would put the tabernacle, and then worship the Lord there at that one place. Instead, we see that happening in many different places. I think it leads to Solomon's downfall, as well as others' downfall later on. But so we're in this dream that Solomon's having, and Solomon asked, I think very wisely, for wisdom, and God's response to that is one that it's kind of like, as a parent, when your child asks for something and you're expecting him to say or her to say, I want this, right? And instead, their reaction is uh, something for their sibling or something for someone else, and you realize, that it's not a selfish act. And so, what do you as a parent want to do in that case? What's your own reaction to your child? It's the same one God has to Solomon. Don't you want to give him or her what they didn't ask for? So God's reaction was, verse 10, it says it was pleasing, and then in 11 it says, because you have asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or have the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice, I have done according to your words. Behold, I've given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I've also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. And so God says, you didn't ask for long life, you didn't ask for great wealth, you didn't ask for the life of your enemies, but because of that, I will give you what you asked for. I'll also give you uh, great wealth and honor. But in the next verse, what's the thing that he says about the long life? Does he give him long life? Does he promise that to him? Yeah. There's a statement that says, if you obey, right? Keeping my commandment, my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, right? If you walk in my ways. So he will have long life. He will be able to enjoy that, but it takes work on his part in order to do that. Then in verse 13, we see that, or 15, I'm sorry, we see that Solomon wakes up, realizes it was a dream, then goes to Jerusalem now and makes an offering of burnt offering and peace offerings in Jerusalem at another altar. So that's where we see this seemingly split action of certain things seem to be done at Gibeon, others now done at Jerusalem. So we see that Solomon has begun his reign as king. We don't know exactly how early on this was in his reign, but it would have been fairly early. God came to him, asked him for these. He asked for this wisdom, this ability to judge his people, the Lord's people, and makes that clear in verses 6 through 9. All right. Any comments on that before we enter into the main part of what chapter 3 and we see his wisdom. It's a good point about what God has asked Solomon to do here in honoring him and obeying him. Ephesians, the 6th chapter that you referred to, where children are commanded to obey their parents. and all of those have consequences, right? And and I think that's part of it. There are certainly things that happen that are beyond someone's control, but there are also many choices that children make or we make ourselves that are not in honor to God that have a consequence of early death or instant death. So, so there's a lot of things that we need to understand, not only as children, but as parents and adults in our relationship with God and how we should honor Him, just as He expected David to, Solomon, Saul. We saw consequences of Saul. We saw consequences when David did not. So, all right. So now in chapter 3, verses 16, specifically through about 28, I'll read to the end, but 16 through 21, we see that there are two harlots that come before Solomon, and they explain what has happened. One has a child. They were living in the same house. One has a child. 3 days later, the other one has a child. And now, all of a sudden, in the night, one night, one of the women rolls over on top of her child or suffocates that child on accident, gets up, realizes that has occurred, swaps babies with the other woman, and the next morning, the second woman wakes up, there's a dead baby in her arms, and she then realizes, wait a minute, that's not my child. And, we don't have, they didn't have access to the DNA sampling and, photographic imagery and whatnot, right? So now, how do you deal with whose child is this after only, it's probably still a very young child. So Solomon's reaction in verse 23, well, in verse 22, we see the other woman jump in and say, no, 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 I didn't do that, and that's my child, and she killed her own child. So the argument ensues, and in verse 23, we see Solomon say, okay, so one says, this is my son who's living, and your son's dead, and the other said, no, or your son's dead, and my son's the one that's living. So, how do we approach that? Knowing the story, it's kind of, extremely obvious, but Solomon is here, and he has to make a judgment to determine whose child is really alive. And so he calls for a sword to be brought to him. They bring a sword. He then says, okay, just cut the baby in half. Just give half to one and half to the other, and then that'll be done. There we go. So what does the child of the living, or the mother of the living child, right, the real mother do? What would her reaction, or what is her reaction, and would it not be similar to what we would have today? Right? Her reaction is no, no, no. Right? She would much rather see the child live and not be his mother than to see the child die. And because of that, Solomon's able to immediately discern, because the woman whose child's already dead, what does she kind of have to lose? Right? It's kind of the thought process and the reaction is, okay, fine, then both of our children are dead. But now the one who's the true mother reacts in a way and says, "Oh my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him." And the other one said, He shall be neither mine nor yours divided." Pretty obvious now at this point who the mother is, and Solomon makes that judgment. And in verse 28, we see the understanding of the people when they hear about this one particular judgment. It says, When all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king. They saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. So, so, so Solomon is now beginning to make his reputation for being one who can solve these difficult issues using wisdom to actually do so. And we'll see very quickly, actually we'll see by the end of the next chapter, what some of the reactions are toward others, that others have toward him. But I guess I got a little bit behind. And so then we'll begin in chapter 4, and we see now how many children of Israel are there? How many groups in Israel are there? How's the land divided? 12 tribes. So Solomon here takes off in chapter 4, and he splits the people up into 12 groups. Are they the same? Are they the tribal lines that we read? They are not. Okay. What was the main reason that he divided them up into these 12 different groups? Some versions call them districts. Well, but what was the purpose? All right. So he splits. He creates 12 deputies. He divides the land up among them, and each one is actually stated as being responsible for providing for Solomon and his household provisions for a month. So after he divides them all up, it tells us that that's what they were to do. And then in verse 22, we see listed what the provisions were for one day of Solomon's house, 22 and 23. But so he divides them up. Then I looked up a lot of these weights and measures of what one of the day's provision was, and throughout the whole thing, all I could do was think back to 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter. I think it's worthy for us to go back there to 1 Samuel chapter 8 and be reminded of exactly the warning to the people when they demanded a king. First Samuel 8, beginning of verse 10. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots." Have we seen that happen? Remember Adonijah? Remember Absalom? And the 50 young men that ran in front of the chariots? Right. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyards and give them to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and take your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. And in verse 19, you see the reaction of the people at that time. It says, nevertheless, they refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but we shall, but there shall be a king over us. So, Saul, during his kingdom, was that a burden at that point? Kind of the first one on the job, kind of new, right? And he is in a few wars, but doesn't have this really kind of a big central government thing. Now, David, as he settles into Jerusalem, some things are still heavily at war, but there's not as much of a burden. Now, we see that uh, one day's provision during Solomon's reign. This would obviously be probably a little bit later in his reign, but during his reign, um, 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fattened oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, some cattle, 100 sheep, and other wild game, at least deer and gazelles and fowl. So imagine the burden of 12 different groups having to provide this, and this is just one day. This is not a week. Uh, did a lot of research last night just trying to figure out why would you need this much, and how much is this? So I think I would say that arguments exist. This would feed anywhere typically from about 14,000 people to 30,000 people a day. Okay. That's the requirement. Of course, at this point, I also put in my notes. I don't remember how many wives he had. Right? So there's 1,000 wives, not to mention all the people that would work under them and for them during that, right? And their daily activities. He himself would have had many. He would have had servants, right? And what did 1 Samuel chapter 8 say? Take 10% of the best of your stuff and we'll give it to who? His own servants, right? Because they have to be taken care of. So now we see this coming to fruition. Now, are the people upset at this point, though? Are they bothered by this piece? Not that we see, right? By the end of this quarter, it's actually kind of in the beginning of the next quarter, but we'll see this begins to be quite a burden on them. And we'll see the people's reaction to Rehoboam, his son, whenever he takes over. But at this point, why are they willing to accept this? Why would we be willing to accept it? You got the benefit of what they wanted, right? They got exactly what they wanted. Weren't they enjoying great prosperity at this time? Huh? That's right. There was peace. Their borders were growing. They're building this massive temple, and the entire Jerusalem area is being built with lavish, goods and things. And they see all this gold and all this silver, and I mean, everything's wonderful. So why would you brag about that? So, but a significant amount of effort just to feed the people. Now, the other piece after verse 25 or 26, really, it says Solomon had. Now, my version, and I understand there's some discrepancies in some of the manuscripts. My version said Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Those deputies provided for King Solomon and all who came to the king and to King Solomon's table each month and left nothing lacking. They also brought barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds to the place where it should be, each according to his charge. So then they not only had to make sure that they provided the daily provisions to the king, they had to also care for the animals that he had in the many different places that he would have kept livestock, so they had to feed them as well. So we can certainly begin to see that there's a much greater burden on the people now. Um, these people worked, many of them, farmer type folks, and this would have been a pretty significant burden. They would have had to feed their own family and make sure that they stockpiled enough so that they had their portion of what was going to be given to King Solomon every year. So um, this is it's going to start to be fairly taxing, and we have to remember they had thousands of young men that were also taken and put in charge of all the different projects that are happening. So it's a pretty significant challenge for them. All right, then 29 through 34 of chapter 4, we see that others are now recognizing the wisdom of Solomon. And 29 makes it clear, now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind like the sand that is on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. Lists several men there. It says that his fame was known in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, 1,005 songs were his. He spoke of the trees, from the cedars that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke of the animals, the birds, and creeping things. Men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So someone who can sit there and expound on, even suggesting even nature and why it did what it did and all these things, right? The depth of his understanding and the wisdom that he had was unsurpassed. God even told him that no one else would be able to would have that, and it was so great that people from other nations get that, and we'll see Queen Sheba who comes later, just to sit at his feet to see the things that he says and the things that he does. So that kind of wraps up chapters 3 and 4, but there's some thoughts that I think we can certainly take from this. Do we want help? Or do we want to help God today? That question, I'll have to say this, as I get the question looks, that made a lot more sense last time. But it still makes sense today. Does David took the ark and he brought it into Jerusalem. The tabernacle was at Gibeah, and so people started moving this around, started doing different things. Also, we see that Solomon marries, but what's his reason for marrying? For peace. Does God need all that? Did Solomon need to marry 700 wives to make sure that he made peace on his border? No. But Solomon was willing to help God, right? Do we do that today? Do we run around, try to help God out? So how can we examine our own lives and make sure that we're not going beyond what God has said and doing things that we may like to do ourselves, and reason that into assisting God? All right. Talked about this during the lesson, but what would our reaction be if God were to come and ask us, what would you wish me to give you? I think that's a very, very uh, difficult question for some of us, certainly for me, maybe not for everyone. Um, and then I think, and we'll see this as we continue to deal with Solomon and the things that he had. But do we let our own talents or our own desires impede us? Solomon allowed, here in the next few lessons, we're going to see him. Uh, he had such great wisdom, this great talent that he had. He had the ability to do so many things, yet he eventually allows that to impede the things that he does. So can we look at ourselves and say, well, I'm really good at this, so therefore I have to continue on, right? And I have to do this every day. And by the way, that may mean I miss here, and I don't focus as much on here, and I don't have time to read the Bible, and I don't have time to study with anyone else, and I don't have the time to share the word with anyone else. Why? Well, because I have to use my talents. Do we find ourselves in those situations? Um, we'll consider those definitely more as we read and study about Solomon. But some of the few things that I thought of during this lesson, and many of us know uh, things that happened to Solomon. And all right, our time is up. Any other comments or questions? All right, thanks for your attention.